Hey you guys, what's up? I am back with my promised tutorial of this mama and her little colt. The colt's name is Cobalt, by the way, which I did use the color Cobalt in this painting. So anyway, I just wanted to do a shortened version of this tutorial for all of my YouTube subscribers. I did do a real-time, in-depth tutorial where I explained as I went for my Patreon subscribers. We're going to have a lot of fun in February because we are painting the landscape painting of Ireland. I hope you guys will join us for that. Let's get started on this tutorial. So in this first section of the painting, I am working on the back of the horse and softening that edge because there was a little angle there. So what I would do is I would moisten the whole area that's already painted, and I would go in with a soft, actually a pretty hard scrubber brush, and just scrub along the back of the mare's top line just to soften that line and to take out an ugly little angle. And if you missed it, I did already do a video on how I completed this really splashy background. So if you want to go check out that video, I will link it up here. Okay, now I am putting in a shadow behind the colt's face on the mare's belly, and I'm using a mixture of cobalt blue and Windsor violet. And you'll notice that I didn't use just one color in that big shadow. It's a pretty large sized shadow, and so to keep it interesting, I used two different hues that are the same tone, and that helps keep a shadow interesting, or any area interesting. If you can, use more than one color to keep your areas of color interesting. Don't use just one color. Try to use more than one color to keep the painting looking nice and dynamic. Okay, now I wet the entire horse, and I wanted to do her hindquarters, but I wanted to keep it soft, so I wet the whole horse, not just the hindquarters, her middle section on up, because I didn't want there to be any hard edges. So you want to remember when you're doing watercolors and you're creating these delicate, especially on horses, these delicate tonal gradations and the muscle structures, you want to wet the whole area and let it dry a little bit. You don't want it puddling. You want it just kind of damp. And then I put in some cobalt and Windsor violet to define her hindquarters. Okay, now I'm going in with my Simply Simmons size 0 brush liner, and I will put a link to that brush below. And I'm using that just to put in the details of the mane, and I'm using a combination of lamp black and ultramarine blue. And I do that just so that the black is not flat. It still needs to have a little sparkle in it. And if you use a flat black paint, it's just gonna dry to a really dull, luster-less sheen. It's not gonna look good. So almost always at least mix a color into your black if you're not gonna mix your own blacks. So that will help keep everything vibrant and interesting. Okay, so to do the first part of her face, I wet the entire face, and then I just put in the delicate shadows that were a lighter tone, and then later I would go in with drier paper, sometimes completely dry paper, and put the details of her face in with the liner brush. And then if it was like a ridge bone, for example, and it's a pretty hard line, you still want it to have a bit of softness. So what I would do is paint onto dry paper, and then I would go in with my finger and go dot, 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 and I would soften up that line that way. So that's a good way to get a softer line and not have such hard edges, but you're still maintaining a lot of control, and you're getting that hard edge, but it's still got a soft look to it. For the eyes of this mare, they are maybe 5 millimeters wide. So as you can imagine, you can't do a lot of detail, so you're definitely painting on very dry paper, and you're just putting in little dots to create the shape of the eyes. So you really want to watch and make sure that you get the shape right when you're painting this small, because you're not going to be able to get little details and little reflections in the eyes and things like that. There's just obviously no way. So you just want to pay more attention to, am I getting the shape of the eye right? After I got in the larger details of the face, I went in with the really dark things like the nostrils and the lips and painted those with lamp black because I was working in a very small area. So using lamp black in that small of an area isn't going to matter. So I went ahead and just used my lamp black for some of these smaller, tiny little details in the mare's face. I used a dagger brush to put in some grass details, and that is a really good brush because it's really long and it holds a lot of water because it's thicker towards the ferrule and then it comes out to a point. So that's a really good brush to use for grass textures, and I used that brush a lot when I was putting in final details in the grass area. And for the jewelry part of the painting, which I talked a lot about in my recent horse video, I again used my gel pen, and I used the gel pen to put the little white glint in her eye and some white mane strands in her mane, and also some white strands of hair in the tail area. And I used that very sparingly, but I think it really helped make this painting shine towards the end. Working on the muscles of the foal now, so let's talk a little bit about how I did the muscles. I talked a lot about how to paint muscles in my last how to paint horses video, so be sure to refer to that as well. But you want to keep those muscles defined but soft, and that's challenging. You have to get just the right amount of water on your paper. So you want to get your paper wet and then maybe blot it up a little bit, and then use probably a milk consistency of paint in your paintbrush, and it just depends on how dark the muscles are. On the mare in this painting, her muscles are really subtle, and I had to use a really light touch and a little bit less paint in my paintbrush. But for the foal, his muscles were very sharp, had a lot of sharp contrast in them because he's bonier. So that light hits those muscles and the bones under the muscles, and it just really makes some dark and light contrast throughout his body for the muscle contours. So for the foal's muscles, I used a lot drier paper and a lot more paint in my brush. And what you can do is you can paint in the sharp muscle contours and just pay attention to the shape. Don't think in your mind, I'm painting horse muscles. Think in your mind, okay, this muscle shape is kind of a long triangle. This shape is more of an oval. And so be sure to look at your shapes, get the angles and the shapes correct, because horse anatomy is pretty important. And then you can let it dry, and then you can paint over it to soften those contours if you need to. And then if you need even more contouring and lightening, you can go in with a scrubber brush, get the whole area wet and get it damp, and you can blot it off. And then you go in with the scrubber brush and lift out more highlights out of the muscle areas if you've got a lot of strong contrast in the muscles of the horse. It just depends. Every horse has different muscles, and there's different light circumstances that are going to create different levels of contrast and how much the muscles show. So for this foal, I used burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. And isn't it amazing how different in color the mare is? But for the mare's, a lot of the mare's musculature and contours, I use the same colors, but just a very different ratio, mostly ultramarine blue with a hint of burnt sienna. And then the foal is a bunch of burnt sienna with a little bit of ultramarine blue added in to darken him up. To sign this painting, I used a mix of green that I have on my palette, and to mix a nice green that is not overpowering, I almost always add naphthol red to my green. And then I use this mix. It's a pretty dark green if you added that naphthol red. And I probably used ultramarine blue and aureolin to create the green, and then added some red. And then I used my liner brush to sign the painting. I used to use a Sharpie to sign my painting, but a Sharpie isn't archival. Don't do that. So I stopped doing that, and I've started signing my name with a liner brush. And I have horrible handwriting, so I'm not a big fan of my signature, but what do you do? So towards the end of the painting, I felt like the background kind of took over the painting, and the white mare did not pop out enough. So what I did at the very end of this painting is I took wet clear water and just brushed over the entire background of the upper third of the painting and got it completely wet, not puddled wet, but pretty wet. And I went in with some cobalt and I painted quite heavily around her face and her back to really pop out those areas especially. And then the corners of the paintings, I also put in a lot of cobalt to darken that, and then a light wash of cobalt throughout the background of the painting to push the background back, because I really wanted the mare and her foal to come forward, and the background was beautiful and had a lot of movement in it, and it was really great, but it was a little too strong to support the mare, so I had to push it back with some cobalt blue in the end, and it really helped with the composition. And I will link my horse video at the end of this, and also I will link a subscribe button that you can hit. If you're on your phone, you can just hit the little link that I provide at the end of this video and subscribe. And please do be sure to subscribe, because I upload 1 to 2 new videos every week, and I have a backlog of videos coming up. So stay tuned and hit the subscribe button and the bell button so you make sure that you don't miss any new videos coming up. And I hope you guys are having a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye, you guys.